Thank you, Becky, for the nice warm-up for this panel. And it sounds like we had a really good night last night, so that's exciting as well. This morning, this first panel is EV Influx, and we have Shane Ermeth. Yes.
Don't be scared. It's okay. I won't bite hard.
Egyptian Electric, and Bobby Williams from Southwestern. And then we have Greg Eckel from Horn Belt. And they are all engineers from SIUC, so bear with me, all right? We thought this was a timely topic to talk about, and we got together and we kind of chatted over these questions, and I am really excited about this panel because they really do have a wealth of knowledge, and this is an exciting upcoming topic because there's a lot of growth going on with EVs, and these guys have a lot of interesting things to say. So with that, we will go ahead and kick it off. With the potential for a significant influx of EVs coming onto your systems, what types of issues has your co-op identified regarding infrastructure needs, and how do these differ short-term versus long-term?
Now you made the first mistake of handing me the mic. And then the second one was putting 3 SIU graduates together. So we're going to try to behave. For Egyptian Electric, if you don't know where Egyptian Electric is, we're in southwest Illinois. We have 10 counties. Most of our electric vehicle penetration is really the Metro East and the St. Clair County area, and primarily Jackson County. For us, we see a little bit of intermediate to long-term concerns. Onesie, twosies falling into the fleet where we think we can manage with the existing infrastructure, but long-term, when you start seeing 2 electric vehicles in a garage with an existing service, that's going to start being problematic, and how we address that as a construction work plan moving forward is something that we're starting to have discussions in our boardroom.
For Southwestern, we're seeing the same thing. The Metro East area is where we see our influx at. Luckily, as engineers, we oversize our system throughout these last decades, and so, like Shane said, the initial influx has been able to be absorbed with our current infrastructure. But looking forward, we're going to have to look at our long-term work plans and see if we need to upsize our base transformer size for subdivisions and new residential homes, and even commercial buildings. If they're looking at fleet charging or anything of that nature, it's going to really add to the cost, and then the next step is, how do we recover that cost? So those are the things that are on our horizon as far as looking at where we go from here.
We've gotten a lot of EV influx as well in the Bloomington Normal area. We are monitoring our transformer loading. We've already changed out 7 to 8 distribution units for overloading. So coming up with the definition as to what's overloaded is a whole nother question as well. So long term, we recently completed a work plan study, and as part of that, we did some sensitivity analysis looking at 15% uniform load growth across our electrical infrastructure, as well as 30%. And that was not to give Don a heart attack as to what engineering was going to propose for capital expenditures. More so, it was to understand where we might see things pop up as a problem. So it's more, what didn't show up at 30% as much as what does show up at 30%.
One of the goals in the Illinois Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, or CEJA, was to put 1 million EVs on the state roads by 2030. Approximately how many EVs do you have in your service territories now, and what kind of growth do you anticipate?
Well, we use the Secretary of State's website. They provide information on alternate fuel vehicles by zip code and by county. So for the zip codes that in and around surrounding the Egyptian Electric territory, we're at 247 electric vehicles in that footprint. The trend that we're seeing, when we started tracking it a few years ago, it was one or 2 added a month. Now we're seeing 7 to 10 added a month. So if you start doing some aggression analysis on it, we project in a year or 2 a doubling factor each and every year. From last year to current year, we've seen 72 electric vehicles been added in that zip code footprint. So The pattern that we're seeing is that it's not decreasing, it's linearly increasing, especially in our St. Clair County and our Jackson County service territory. What was the second part of that?
Well, from a year ago.
A year ago, we've gained 72 electric vehicles in 1 year inside that footprint. So it's one of those that we talk a little bit about, you know, you can absorb some of that, but at some point, we do have some members that we've talked to that own like 2 Tesla vehicles. They have a Tesla Powerwall, they've got solar on their home. They're very intelligent about how they're charging those cars, but I think they're well in tune to how they need to charge that car. Our concern long term is say you have a Tesla and you have an F-150 Lightning in the garage and they come home at 5 p.m. It's the horror story that we all are concerned about is, will there be enough electricity on the grid to charge all these cars? And it's one of those that we have to continue to monitor as engineers and discuss construction work plans. And as Bobby said, who's gonna pay for that infrastructure?
We've seen, the last I looked using the same data Shane was mentioning, we're just shy of 1,200 in our zip codes that we serve. We serve around 51 zip codes. The majority of those are in the Metro East area. We serve the I-70 and I-55 corridor in that Metro East. So we anticipate almost a doubling factor, like Shane said, in the next couple of years, just because the new models coming to market. Oh, well, that's one thing I forgot to do. You want to get that for me, Craig? Sorry about that. But we will see doubling at least, I would think, because we got a lot of folks that commute to St. Louis, and so they come to the Illinois side, go to bed, and go back to work the next morning. So just like Shane said, we're keeping a close eye on it, and luckily, with the charging infrastructure that's out there, we have installed a few chargers ourselves, but most charging is done residentially, and so like these two guys have said, we got to keep an eye on our system, monitor our metering, and make sure that we're not causing problems. I'm surprised we've not had an overload like Greg has, but it's just a matter of time, and it's just a matter of when we're going to have to build that infrastructure and timing. And as the new models come to market, I think there's quite a few more now than there were the last couple of years. We saw in the last year, I think they added almost 400 EVs in our 50 zip codes. So in the last 7 years, we've seen a 600% increase in EVs in our territory. So, and I think that curve is going to get steeper and steeper. I know Brad and I were talking this morning, and I believe that we're going to see that just continue to grow as new models come to market.
Well, after Bobby got a call, I'm getting calls now from my bosses. So anyway, the
Did you tell Don not to call you?
yeah, he's heckling me for some reason. No, just kidding.
Lesson 1, turn your phone off when you're on stage.
So currently, we monitor about 170 known locations for EVs. So the trick there is known locations, right? We have over 130 members on our EV rate. It's a voluntary rate. It's a very popular rate. If you go to Tesla actually has a service center in Bloomington Normal where you could get work done or pick up your Tesla. And what's interesting, if you go in there, they're very familiar with our program. It's that popular. So Bloomington Normal, what's interesting as far as, you know, EV penetrations, it's changed a lot for us over the last year. It seems like we've had a lot of Rivian vehicles come on the system. But historically as well, when Mitsubishi was in the Bloomington Normal area, they rolled out the IMEV. So public charging, there's quite a bit of public charging and charging infrastructure in the area already. So that's all I would say about that.
Well, one thing I'd want to add, you know, we're sitting here in the Crown Plaza. If you look across the way when you go, there's a commercial development across the street. Look at the electric infrastructure that was put in to provide electric service to this hotel, the restaurants just north of us, and the difference in the design of what goes into a residential subdivision. Are we going to have to be putting in electric infrastructure that mirrors commercial development through future residential subdivisions. That's what we're talking about. It's a completely different design. It's different size wire, different size transformers, protection schemes, lead times, and cost. All those things are factors that, you know, our assets that we put in the ground today are 30-plus year assets. So decisions that you're making today about infrastructure that you're putting in, you need to account for the electric vehicle infrastructure in some manner. If not, you could be replacing it before it gets to its full cost age of life, and you'll have to replace it. And it's one of those things that engineers are struggling with, is when do we start changing this infrastructure, and what size should it be? I look at it, and Bobby or Greg may be able to comment, is what size are you going to put in? Are you putting in a 7.2 kW charger? Is that how you're going to size a garage? A 19.2 charger for 2 vehicles? You know, you look at the demand of a house. You want to talk about demand on the house a little bit, Bobby? I know you guys have looked at it.
We have. What we're trying to do is we've developed a time of use rate to help push that peak off. And so we had 9 members beta this for us, and what we saw was that they were able to shift their load, and they saw up to 30% rate savings on the time of use rate. So that incentivizing the member is going to work if they're willing to do it, and that's the hard part. In this day and age, people, they just want to come in, flip the light switch, and not have to worry about anything. And so it's really educating the membership and educating not only on the rates, but also on the technology and how to use it, and to also just keep in mind that not everybody understands what impact those EV chargers have and any load that they have. And so you get multiple cars in a garage, that's a 37.5 minimum, maybe almost 50, depending on if it's a 19.2 or a 7.6 that you're charging at. The Tesla we had, I think our charger was right at 11 kW. So it is an impact. I saw my demand at my house go from 12 kW to 21.5 just for the few months I had the charger in place. And so that's significant. In the hot summer like we had a couple weeks ago, you can load a transformer 150%, but you don't want to do it all the time. And in the summertime, if it's loaded at 150%, you're going to have some things glowing out there that you don't want to glow. So just keeping an eye on that and making sure to educate. I think that's the one thing we're trying to do with our membership, is educate in our magazine and our social media, just so that they understand the technology, and if they have any questions, to call in, and we can help guide them anywhere we can.
So we did some analysis on the 130 members we've got on the voluntary time of use program. And I'll just give a shout out to Gary. He did a lot of the legwork on that. But what we found is that with these 130 members, we shifted on average across all 130 members about 1,250 watts out of the peak period. And coincidentally, they all started peaking them typically around 10, 11 o'clock at night. So, so that's a good shift for us. The temperature is a little cooler that late at night, and it's off the critical on peak where everything else is kind of loaded up as well.
Kind of going on that, when we talked about, speaking of people charging at home, and you talking about EV users coming home and charging during peak hours, does your co-op have a time of use rate? And if so, on average, what kind of savings do you see with the time of use rates?
I'll start off, seeing how I really screwed up your message there. Jumped the gun on you, sorry. But no, we instituted a time of use rate. Like I said, we're betaing it with 9 members. We're waiting to get it implemented in our software system. But we have been monitoring it, and at first, they didn't understand the time of use rate. So the first couple months, they didn't see a significant change or significant savings, and we didn't see a shift in their demand. But once our energy manager sat down with those members and explained how it was going to benefit them and how it would work, the next couple months was a significant change. We saw the first month, on average, they were seeing about 12% savings, and we saw that demand shift to the 9, 10 o'clock time frame. And so that helps us tremendously with our demand. And so it's beneficial both for the members and for the cooperative at that point. And so just the education and continued oversight and making sure that they understand that. And whenever we finalized the testing that we were doing with the beta folks, it ranged anywhere from 8 to 32% savings that they saw on their bill. It's pretty significant. 30% savings, especially when we've been seeing the increases that we've seen recently, is significant, and for a lot of these folks, every little bit counts. So anything that we can do as an organization to help recover those costs and to benefit the member, because just like Shane was mentioning, that infrastructure, that cable's bigger, those transformers are bigger, cost for anybody that's been monitoring costs for materials these last couple of years, you know that we've seen 40, 50, sometimes 100% increases on some materials. And then the next step is, how do you recover those? So right now, we're thinking time of use to shift it, but then we got to think long term. Are we creating another peak at that point? Are we just pushing our peak somewhere else? And how are we going to monitor that once we get a bigger influx and a bigger concentration of EVs on our system? So it's something that we'll have to constantly monitor. And with the metering technology that we have now, you can really keep a close eye on that and make sure that you're doing what you need to do. And sending the signals to the members for the rates is what I feel is the best approach, because unless it hits their pocketbook, they're not going to pay attention.
So yeah, we kind of touched a little bit on time of use a little earlier. Earlier studies we had done with the time of use program, when it was at about 30 members, was we saw that every one of our members saved money on the time of use rate, regardless of their behavior or the impact of the behavior. You just looked at the total bill. And we also looked at the economics, because there were some members, there were actually 2 different members that thought, we're not really shifting enough off peak, we're not really saving anything. But we were, through those discussions and interactions with the members, we let them know, if you had the same energy demand and you go back to rate 1, every one of those 30 members in that study, their rates went up. Okay, so we feel like the ratio between our on-peak and off-peak was 6 to 1 in the energy price, and we felt like it sent a very strong signal. And with later studies, like I mentioned earlier, we saw 1,250 watts moved out of our peak demand window, that 5 to 7 time frame, and move our peak till about 10, 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah, Egyptian also has a time of use rate. It's actually, like Bobby said, ours is in beta testing. We have 5 members on it. It's a 3-component time of use. But what we're using it for here in the beginning and for testing is maybe a little bit different. We're not trying to affect member consumption with it. We're working with it to see how does it present on the bill, how does it present if a member looks at their account online, or if they look at it from the smart app on the phone. We are a member of SIPC. We're non-coincident peak billed, so our fear is we would only be moving our peak. We're not able to move outside of a coincident peak window at this moment. So with board approval, I think what we would be looking at doing is, once SIPC makes a decision whether they're going to move to coincident peak or not, we would be ready, because all the testing has been done on that time of use rate. We would coincide that in maybe 2024, 2025, and we would use a time of use rate like Greg had mentioned to try to affect member patterns with it. It's hard to develop a 6 to 1 ratio in a time of use rate when there's no incentive from our G&T to do so. There's no pricing signal that we can give or see, so we would be kind of doing it blind, and it would be of no benefit to us and or the G&T. So that's why we've not implemented a full use time of use rate. However, our board did approve early in the spring. We do have residential demand in place, and we can start talking about it. We put it on at a dime, so most people are only seeing $1 or a little over $1 on the line that says residential demand. It goes back to what Bobby said. How are you going to educate members about the demand hit of an electric vehicle if you don't have demand on the bill? How will they understand the pain of it if there's not a line on the bill? And if it's only being controlled with time of use, that's one way of doing it. But we've given our board the methodology of, you can put it on either line, a little bit here, a little bit there. We're going to use the residential demand line to start talking about demand and how you can reduce demand in not only electric vehicle use, but with future demand response programs.
Kind of along the same lines, just a new act was passed this last session, the Illinois Electric Vehicle Charging Act, and new properties must be EV capable starting in 2024. Thanks, Shane, pointing that out. The Electric Vehicle Charging Act requires any house or multi-unit building completed after January 1st, 2024 to have at least one EV-capable parking space for each residential unit that has dedicated parking. The law also applies to existing multifamily residential buildings that are being renovated. How is your co-op preparing to address building new subdivisions to comply with this new law?
This is kind of a really challenging part for us because, as you know, Rivian's grown exponentially in the number of people that work there. There's been a big housing shortage in Bloomington Normal, so literally today we have 4 different underground subdivisions going on. We've got 3 in the pipe in front of us, and we've completed probably 5 in the last 18 months. So when we're looking at our subdivision design, Don has been a stickler on engineering loading up transformers. So historically, I think we've done a really good job. Historically, we've installed quite a bit of secondary. It's not uncommon to have as many as 11 members off a 50 kVA transformer in a subdivision. So how we chose to approach it is we're putting probably a little less secondary in and a few more transformers, though we're not putting as many as 11 members on a 50 kVA anymore, as we are just strategically placing our transformers that way. If they need to be changed out, they're readily available to change out. If you're putting a lot of secondary in and you're running into overload problems, then you're really caught in a bind. We're still putting transformers out there, 4 transformers to a residential member in average subdivision. We feel that's a good number. We're hoping with the time of use rate that we get a lot of use out of our off-peak periods. As most of you know, you look at a load curve, load duration curve, and there's still a lot of investment out there, capital investment, that we need to use better. So that's our approach, a little less secondary, a few more units, but not necessarily a lot of bigger units. So the other part of the question was, and I'll give a shout out to Joe Priestley and his group here, we've been doing rebates for 50 amp 240 volt receptacles in garages for about 2 years now. We have a rebate for new construction, and his group's been very good about communicating with electricians on new construction when it goes in to be eligible for those rebates. And then we have retrofits as well. So if someone's putting a 50 amp 240 volt receptacle in their garage after it's been built, that is also available for a rebate. So anyway, a lot of short-term and long-term challenges to how you lay out a subdivision considering EVs. We have some other large apartment complex areas going in that we're studying. I mean, and these buildings are large enough, you know, the designers are wanting to use 3-phase services, these large apartment complexes, so they're getting 120, 208, 3-wire. So, and they're all going in with EV charging options as well. So we have a couple developments that are going in with 6 and 7 3-phase 120, 208, 150 kVA transformers, a couple 225s. You're talking about units that have 27 residential apartments. So yeah, a lot of challenges in the engineering areas to how we are designing infrastructure to try to handle that.
We're kind of doing the same thing Greg's doing. We're minimizing our use of secondary pedestals and placing transformers to serve 2 locations. And as we get those new loads, we're actually scrutinizing their loading. Also, we've been requesting more of that, especially on single-family residents that are by themselves, because we have a lot of 320 services. Some of them could be pushing 400, if not 600, on some of the things that they're adding in there. And it's just going to get worse, I think, as we go. Just like to Craig's point, we got to keep an eye on it and really scrutinize what we do moving forward. And luckily, we've changed our construction. We use vaults now for all of our pad-mounted gear so that we can easily switch them out if something's needed. And we are putting everything in conduit now and large enough to upsize if we need to. So if there is an influx or a change that needs to be done, we can easily change that. The cost is minimal up front. It's easier to do up front than it is after the fact. So we figured it'd be best to do it on the front end than the back end. But it's something that we are definitely going to have to keep an eye on moving forward. And we can't keep our eye off the ball. It's going to have to be a constant visual to make sure that we are keeping close tabs on that loading and monitor your system. I think the technology out there to monitor the overloading of the transformers and looking at your coordination. I mean, as these loads increase, your fuse protection and coordination is affected as well. And so as these outages occur, work with your operations department to know if it went through a device or a device operated when it shouldn't have, because that's another impact as well that will affect your reliability. And so there's a lot of aspects, and so engineering's hopping with all these new additions, and it's an interesting time. I didn't have this much gray a couple years ago, so it's been very trying with what we're doing, but I think everybody's seeing in the industry in some impact one way or another, maybe not to some of the growth that we've seen with our areas, but it's coming. It's just a matter of time.
As you noticed, engineers use a lot of numbers, so I'm going to cut through a little bit of that for you, a little bit, and just tell you what we're up against. I built a new home in 2019. I wired the garage for 2 electric vehicles. What we had done is we took an old farmhouse and tore it down. That service had been in place since the 1960s. So that transformer that serves our home is a 15. I'm going to strip out all the KV and all that stuff. So there's a 15 that serves our home. On peak, with our pool running, we're at 17. So we're already over 100% capacity on that transformer. So the challenge that we all have moving forward is you got 2 electric vehicles in the garage. If I put 2 F-150s in there charging it, I'm going to round it to 20. 20 plus 20 plus 17, I believe it's going to be more than 200% on that transformer and the wire moving in. So one of the things that Egyptians Board's going to do, a shout out to Brad and Brooke, our member service manager and engineering manager, we've got a communications challenge to as things get addressed moving forward, we're going to have to communicate these items. Is if you're getting an electric vehicle, the co-op's going to need to know that, not just for a subdivision being built, because we can engineer that out of the gate. That's a decision that the co-op can make. As co-ops start putting more and more electric vehicles into the fleets, we're going to have to do that also. You look at it as a subdivision. One of the things our board is going to look at, our topic for strategic planning in 2024 is the construction work plan. We're going to take a look at it and say, this is how we design today. This is what you're hearing today. How should we be designing for the future? As some more and more subdivisions are going to go into all our service territories, we're all talking about the same thing. We're not seeing a large influx of subdivisions at the moment. A lot of our growth slowed during COVID, and it's shifted away from residential subdivisions into multifamily home and into more commercial industrial. Residential will soon follow and cycle back into that. How are we going to address that? We haven't crossed the bridge, a lot of what Southwest and Corn Belt's talked about, but like us, I think it's going to hit you someday also. So we're going to address that through a strategic planning session with our board. As we're going to reinvent what the co-op construction work plan really looks like.
I was told there'd be no math.
We told you
that. I think this one is important. We've talked a lot about residential EVs, but fleet vehicles stand to have a significant impact as well to your co-ops. What kind of projects are you seeing in your areas in regard to fleet vehicles or school buses?
Well, I'll go first. I think we've been talking a lot to commercial businesses in Jackson County, Illinois. Carbondale is where Jackson County is. Southern Illinois University is in Carbondale. We've been talking to both the City of Carbondale and SIU Carbondale about fleet upgrades. They have, each entities are in the process of writing grants to transform their entire transportation fleets for not only the county, but also the university. Then you throw on top that we're also talking to Southern Illinois Airport that's located just off the outskirts of Murfreesboro. They're wanting to take their entire fleet electrified. As a matter of fact, the airport's already getting delivery of some of their security vehicles later this fall into the spring, so they're already moving forward with fleet. So fleet has me more nervous than residential because you're talking about massive size busing for mass transit busing for the county, the buses that move students in and around Carbondale. If you went to Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, you could get on a bus for free and go out to the mall or go to the grocery store and they'd bring you back toward the towers or toward the campus. They're wanting to replace all those buses with electric buses. Where those buses are parked today are right underneath Egyptian electric lines. So it's something that we're going to have to contend with in short order, and I know that Corn Belt and Southwest has stories about that, but that for me, I'm more worried about the adoption of mass transit vehicles. There's the school bus fleets. All of us have these things in our territories, and those could hit without notice because they could be applying for grants and you not know it, and then all of a sudden they're like, yeah, we're getting 4 school buses, and we need to energize them before the next school year. So keep that in mind too as you're starting your planning.
Yeah, we're seeing some school districts. I think there's a handful that have applied for grant funding. They've not received their school bus yet. Collinsville district, I believe it was 3 years ago, had got a grant for a school bus, but they decided to move their bus garage off of Southwestern lines onto Ameren because Ameren was going to help pay for that. So we lost that load. But it's just a matter of time, like Shane said, before these other rural school districts start seeing some of that influx as well. What we're seeing a lot of is service. So we have a Volvo dealership on our lines that services the big Volvo semi-trucks. And so they're looking at putting a charger in their warehouse to help with that. We have a Laura Buick on our lines in Collinsville. They have just installed a 3-phase service for their charger for their new Hummer. And that was a 750 kVA. So pretty decent sized transformer just to serve a charging need. And like Shane said, these buses and this bigger fleet are more impactful. Some of these could be dedicated substations, depending on the size of the fleet. And so those have a bigger impact, not only on the distribution system, but transmission system as well. And so working with your G&Ts or your providers help with that. And it's just going to happen more. We've not been approached by any municipality that's looking to change their fleet fully, but they're sprinkling some in here and there. So we haven't really kept a real close eye on it because, again, it's a gradual change. But as we see more and more, it's going to take a deeper dive and look and see the long-term impact of this.
While he's handing that mic to Greg, I'll let Greg collect his thoughts. I want to ask you a question. How many of you serve rest areas along the interstate or truck stops? Look at the size of over-road vehicles that are in there extended period of time. You heard from John Deere yesterday of what they're trying to do with the agriculture fleet. If you get if you get those big semis that are going to be in there, we're talking what they say megawatt chargers, and you're going to have how many of those trucks are there, and what kind of infrastructure co-ops are going to have to put into the rest stops and the truck stops. So that's going to be phenomenal to start thinking about. So I'm going to pivot back to Greg because I know he's got a good story to tell on this one.
Yeah, there's a couple different examples I'd like to give on this one. One is we do have an 8-position Tesla charger on our system. To give you a little perspective, that sits in a parking lot of a big box store that's a grocery store. And so I want to kind of contrast some numbers for you on those. The Tesla station the last 2 months has peaked at around 1 month 1,042 kW, and the other month at 1,050 kW. During those months, we sold about 88,000 kilowatt hours of energy, okay? And a lot of you may not know there's no perspective there, right? The big box grocery store, on the other hand, peaked about 365 kW, and we sold about 288,000 kilowatt hours of energy, okay? So these large charging infrastructures can have some poor load factor, and it's something, you know, to take into account when you're making large capital investments as well. We're very fortunate in that we have and I'll mention it because they're public, Connect Transit, and they provide public transportation for Bloomington Normal. And I have a little story to tell on myself here. We go and meet with them. They have this grandiose plan for electric buses, okay? And they said, you know, I think they had, I'm remembering a number of like 42 buses, and their plan is to change out their entire fleet ultimately to that, right? And so they talk about these grandiose plans. I think we've all met with members that have these really large plans. So, you know, when we come back to the office, it's kind of like, well, what size transformer are we going to give them? Okay, they initially are going to go in with 3 level 3 chargers, and Alan Meisner and myself are back at the office, and we're like, should we give them a 500 kVA unit or a 750 kVA unit? And we're like, well, you know, yeah, that's their plans, but what's going to be realistic, right? So, and this gives you kind of the idea of how fast things are moving with everything going on out there. So we don't end up visiting with the Connect Transit folks for about 18 months, 24 months, and when we talked to them next, they said, well, we changed our mind on the inverter we wanted to put in to charge our buses. We are not putting 3 inverters in. We put one 1.5 megawatt inverter in that has 20 75 kW inverters within it, okay? And we said, well, you didn't really share that with us. We only really, we gave you a 750 kVA transformer, so you're good for about half that. That was kind of, you know, an eye-opening experience. And then the next time we come out to visit with them and talk to them, they already have 12 electric buses. They have a purchase order in place to get 5 this fall, and they got a purchase order in place to have 5 more next spring. 22 electric buses. The first versions they purchased, 450 kilowatt hour batteries. The rest of them they purchased, 650 kilowatt hour batteries. Okay, so trying to make sure that doesn't hit our system peak is going to be very challenging. I think that's the one thing at Corn Belt we've tried to tackle it with rates to try to give the members the right signal. And I want to give a shout out to the Connect Transit folks. In fact, they're doing a microgrid study, and you can't default them for that. You know, we've had discussions with them. They're used to diversifying their fuel, hedging their fuel. Now they're all electric. So they're asking questions. How can we hedge our electricity prices? How do we have a backup plan? Okay, so those are legitimate questions this member is asking us. They've become very educated. I will say that they know the net metering programs better than 90% of the solar folks out there. And they're very educated on demand. We've given them a 2-part demand rate. They pay 2 demands, one in the off-peak period, one in the on-peak period. The on-peak period one looks a lot like our G&T providers' price signal they give us. So we were very upfront with them, so they manage their peak demand in the on-peak period very well. In fact, I can say in April, the load factor from the substation they serve was well over 100%. I guess in kind of trying to summarize all that is that it seems to be happening pretty quickly, and you know, just engage and communicate with your members and try to put those things in place that provide the proper incentives and disincentives. You know, I think you mentioned dealerships. There's a pocket of dealers on Route 150 there in Business 55, and we serve all of them. Ford, Toyota, all of them. They're all putting in level 3 chargers. Ford's putting in a 225 kW 2-port charger, okay? But they're all putting in some various level of charging, whether it's level 3 or level 2, so.
Thank you. I think we could talk about, like I said, we could talk about this all day long, but I think that that is our time. I thank you guys very, very much. I had a couple more questions, but does anybody have any questions for my panel? Go ahead, Scott.
I hear you use the term time rate when to shift it to the evening. At what point are you
So I'll try not to give my 15-minute answers, Don would say.
Good luck with that.
Yeah. That's a good question. We ask ourselves that because ideally, we'd like to see a time of use signal across all of our rates. And, that's kind of an engineering thing, right? And we kind of have asked ourselves what's that look like? And we're trying to maybe slice up the capacity of the system. Maybe a time of use price signal looks a little different for electric heat than it does EVs and those kind of things. So to your point, yes, if you look at the California duck curve, is kind of where that comes from with higher penetration. You can have low load scenarios. With net metering 2.0, the way is set up, it's more like net billing, but it's to encourage battery installations with solar is the way we sell that. And I think those talking points are working out very well without getting into too much more discussion about that.
One way that Egyptian's going to look at it is each of us have an advanced metering infrastructure, AMR, AMI system. You're collecting metering data. If you have a meter data management system that can analyze that, you should be able to see on an hourly or even granularly into 15, 30-minute increments what your load's looking like every hour. For us as SIPC co-ops, when they develop a coincident peak program, if they get to that point, they're going to give us a price signal and say within this hour of time you need to start lowering that demand. That's where you could build a time of use rate for that area, because for us it's in Southern Illinois, it's probably going to be in the 5 to 8 o'clock hour at night during the summer that we need to shift load out of that. So we could use a time of use rate like the others are discussing. And if you want to buy energy during that rate, it's going to be more expensive. And each distribution co-op, with the help of the GNT, is going to have to decide what that's going to look like. For Egyptian, for example, we may be able to take a rate, and if we do a 6.1, okay, it's going to be 6 times more expensive to use during that time window than maybe after the 10 o'clock hour. Will that be enough incentive to get people to not use electrical energy, maybe not charge that car or something else, and shift it into the 10 o'clock hour when the sun has gone down? Generation is a different asset that we got to consider, but from the loading side of it, I think that's how I would present that to Egyptian's board, is how we may be able to use a time of use rate to the benefit of not only us, but for the GNT.
One thing I'd add with that is the problem with trying to shift the load when the solar panels are producing is that not everybody's home. And so I think what you're going to see is maybe some businesses, and some are looking now, of providing charging for their employees as a benefit. And so that would be one way of shifting that to help with that, to incentivize your commercial members to do that for their employees so that you can shift that usage to that time period. But it's definitely something we're going to have to keep an eye on, because, yeah, you can shift it one way and cause another problem long term, and definitely have to keep an eye.
All right. Well, we are definitely now out of time. So you all did you behaved very well, and thank you guys very much. It was very.
Now, Brenda was really nervous that we were really going to take over, so we did.
All right. Okay. Thank you guys very much.